You may have seen the headlines. Microplastics found in the human brain, levels increasing over time, higher concentrations in people with dementia. We covered that study, and a lot of people saw it. Then a chemical scientist, Dr. Michelle Wong, reached out to us and told us that the method used to measure those plastics may have been measuring brain fat instead. So we did what we said we'd always do. We went to the primary literature. We read the critique. And then Dr. Wong introduced us to someone who could explain it. Dr. Oliver Jones is a professor of analytical chemistry at RMIT University in Melbourne. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, a graduate of Imperial College London and Cambridge, and one of only 118 scientists around the world named to the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry periodic table of outstanding younger chemists. He spent over 20 years developing methods to measure what's actually in the world around us, and he was one of the first scientists to publicly flag the problem with this study. This is a conversation about what we know, what we assumed we knew, and what it looks like when the evidence shifts under a claim you've already made. This is Your Brain on Microplastics. So, Ollie, when we put out this conversation about microplastics, one of our mutual acquaintances or your friend, Dr. Michelle Wong, reached out and said, hold on, there's more to this story than just that. So we went back and we read about it. And it was essentially about how the brain accumulates plastic and that there is research that found plastic in the brain. And there were pictures of visible plastic pieces sitting in brain tissue, which was terrifying, to be honest with you. So give us an idea of what is actually being detected and how this study was brought about.
Yeah, great question. So the thing is, this study had a number of different approaches to measuring microplastics. And measuring microplastics, it's a very challenging field, as in most analytical chemistry, when you're trying to detect things at really small amounts or really low concentrations. People often see something like NCIS or a show like that, and they're like, oh, you just put the sample in the instrument and press the button and it tells you the answer, right? And it doesn't work like that. This particular study was using a technique called pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially how that works is, if you think about a molecule of plastic, it's a polymer, right? So they're long chains of repeating subunits. You could think of it like a bit like a Lego model almost. You can have all these little individual components and you can put them together to make longer chains or longer structures. Those polymer molecules are too big to go into a mass spectrometer. So the first thing you have to do is break them down. And that's where the pyrolysis step comes in. So you're essentially heating up your sample to a high temperature, several hundred degrees, without oxygen. Then you fragment these long chains into smaller subparticles or subchains, I should say. They then move into the chromatograph, which separates them based on size and polarity. So you've got a mixture of all these complex sort of fragments. You then move them through the chromatography, and they separate out, and then they go into the mass spec where they're detected. But what you're actually detecting is the breakdown products or any sort of reaction products that might have happened in the pyrolysis. Right? So the pyrolysis destroys the original sample, and then the data that comes out of that, you're using that to infer what was in the original sample. And there's all sorts of things that can go wrong with a complex biological sample like brain tissue compared to a pure sample. And the issue is that a plastic polymer chain, it's basically a long hydrocarbon chain, right? Mm-hmm. So you're breaking it down into smaller hydrocarbon chains. But if you have a biological sample, which is full of, say, fats are also hydrocarbon chains. So the fragments of some plastics, to be fair, not all plastics, but some plastics look like the breakdown products of fats. So if you're using a fat-rich tissue, there's a potential that you might misidentify some of the compounds that the end products from your mass spectrometer as fats when they're not actually fats at all, they're something else. So you've got to be really sure that there's no other sort of interfering product that might look like the plastic, but it's actually something else.
And let me just challenge myself with my old organic chemistry.
Oh my gosh, be careful.
I know.
It's been a while.
I might pull a muscle. But we have gas chromatography, we have light chromatography, we have electron chromatography. Don't correct me. Let's just say that's correct. But the point is, whether it's light, whether it's gas, it's supposed to separate the molecules depending on their characteristics. And we have models of those. So we know that if it shows up here, it's this molecule, and if it shows up here, it's this molecule. That's where we use light to basically see planetary changes far, far away because of the light spectrum. Here, you're saying that the plastics, when they're broken down, the product often looks like regular fat products that you see in normal tissue. So distinguishing those is going to be very different. Is that right? Or did I just completely? Okay, fantastic. Yes.
Wow.
Okay, good.
Okay,
Okay, fantastic. Ali, I'm glad that something came out of that organic chemistry class.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. So we're not measuring the polymers directly. We are measuring breakdown products of those polymers. And if you think of something like polyethylene, so if you think back to organic chemistry, ethylene is just basically long carbon chain with hydrogens coming off.
Yeah.
And fats are shorter, C8, C9 or something with hydrogen.
You don't have to patronize me, Ali. I'm joking.
So you imagine if you've got a long chain that breaks down into a smaller chain, and that smaller chain looks like something else that happens to be a similar structure, a similar shape, then it's very easy to mix the two up.
But is it possible when we're breaking these plastics, is it possible that some remnants of it are distinct from tissue, that we could actually say, no, this is a signature that can't be eliminated, or no, usually it's very indistinguishable?
Well, it's possible, but it's very tricky. So the thing is, if you have started with a very long chain, you should get a sort of wide spread of some small chains and some larger ones.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got mostly, say, fats, which are much smaller to start with, you wouldn't get many bigger ones, right? Because you started small and you probably stayed small. But if you started big, you can get a whole range of stuff. And if you look at some of the spectra from the Plastic-in-Brain study, they're missing the stuff at the top end that we would expect to see if it was mainly plastic that was breaking down over fats. There is a problem when you use fatty tissue in pyrolysis GCMS, and they tried to correct for it by digesting with potassium hydroxide. The slight problem is, going back to the organic chemistry, if you mix potassium hydroxide with fats, what you tend to end up with is essentially soap. And soap is also a hydrocarbon, and it can also give you products that look a bit like plastics. And you also have to be very sure that you've added enough. How do you know how much potassium hydroxide to add to make sure you digested everything? You need to do a lot of method development work and then prove with known samples that you get the accurate results. Even if you say, I found plastic in my sample, you've got to be really sure where it came from. So body bags, for example, are made of plastic. Labs are full of plastic. Even in the air, if you just put like a slide out and leave it in the lab for a bit, you'll find some microplastic on it, probably from background contamination. So you need to be able to understand where's the background contamination and where's what I'm really sure is coming in from my sample. And then this study was reporting something like 7 grams of microplastic in an entire brain. So they measured a small amount and then calculated out. That's much higher concentration in a human brain than we actually find in raw sewage in many cases, right? Because my research group does a lot of work in the environmental area, and we've been looking at microplastics in sewage sludge, and you don't find as much as they were reporting. It's much, much less. So it seems very unlikely that you would be able to get plastic particles somehow getting into the body and then accumulating it past the blood-brain barrier, which is notoriously difficult to get past, and then not having any effect at all. If I said to you, look, I'm going to put a plastic spoon in your brain, you're not going to say, go straight ahead, right? You're going to be worried. But if we all really did have a plastic spoon's worth of microplastic in our brain and it doesn't do anything, that would indicate that they're really safe, right? Which is probably not the message that the paper was trying to get across.
Yeah, it's so funny that you used the example of plastic spoon. Shamefully, we actually used the example of plastic spoon in our video.
Spoon, and I was holding. Did you know that this is actually? We have this many plastic.
That's gonna be in your history, scientific history.
But I'm talking to Ollie right now, and
that's right.
I feel good that
we challenge ourselves.
Challenging ourselves.
Fantastic.
That's very interesting. Coming back to the point of exposure and contamination, you said body bags are plastic, and there was a concept that was introduced, I think it was in one of the papers, that said that the brains that were actually stored in, whether it was formaldehyde or some other solution, they were in a plastic vessel or a container, and the longer it stays in that container, the more the possibility of more microplastics being embedded into the tissue is also very higher, which kind of makes sense. If you put something in a plastic container, obviously it's going to leach over a period of time. Does that make sense, Ollie?
It does. And also, if you think about it, they centrifuge the sample, right? Centrifuge tubes are made of plastic, and every time you screw and unscrew the lid, you're going to generate microplastics. And they could potentially fall into the sample, and then you've got contamination, right? So if you're going to accurately quantify microplastics in any sort of biological sample using pyrolysis GC or spectroscopy with light, you've got to be really sure you've pulled out all possible things that might influence your result. Because remember, we're talking a very small amount. So it's very easy to double the concentration, even with a small amount of contamination. And multiple bits can add up, right? So you could have a bit of contamination from the lab the brain was in, you could have a bit from the morgue, you could have a bit from where you processed your samples. And I just think if you come up with any sort of experiment you're doing and you come up with something that sounds really odd, like a whole plastic spoon in my brain, really, that's a big claim. And you need, I think if you've got big claim, you need a lot of evidence to back it up, because a lot of people were really worried about, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to my brain with these microplastics.
It's interesting that earlier you said that the brains were being kept in formaldehyde and plastic containers. During my fellowship at UCSD, I was doing a lot of pathology, tissue slices, and and it has one of the largest brain banks, and all of them were being kept for years in plastic containers with formaldehyde. And thinking of that, it's almost guaranteed that there will be contamination of plastic in those brains.
People are worried about eating spinach out of a plastic bag. Obviously, if you're going to keep a brain sample for 5, 10, 12 years in a plastic container, there's going to be leaching. Speaking about brains, they also looked at some dementia samples. There were 12 brains total, 6 was Alzheimer's, 3 vascular dementia, and 3 other dementia, mixed diagnosis. The sample is pretty small too. We all know that you basically need a larger sample to make such a huge claim.
Especially if your measurement tool is not sensitive enough to delineate delta.
Exactly.
Or a change. Look at a change. If you can have an N of 1, if your tool is so sensitive for the outcome, that's fine. But when you have this kind of uncertainty, 3 people here and 4 people in the Alzheimer's, how many of them had Alzheimer's?
6 had Alzheimer's.
6 had, that's a small sample.
And 3 other dementias. And when you look at the concentrations, because I actually nerded out on the papers and I went to read the different micrograms of the polyethylene that they found out, and it was wildly high in dementia samples. It was 26,776 micrograms per gram, as opposed to 3,000 for liver and kidney. That's a huge difference. And the authors, to some credit to them, they basically noted that atrophied brain tissues, especially the ones that had impaired blood-brain barriers and poor clearance, they said that it potentially, they would concentrate plastics more, or anything more for that matter. But again, I think they never really highlighted the fact that it could have been the plastic containers.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
It just creates a lot of fear in the public when they hear things like that.
And with Alzheimer's, another thing that you see, and this is reflective in other contaminations such as viral and all these kind of things that you see post-mortem in Alzheimer's patients, is secondary to the fact that the blood-brain barrier becomes incredibly leaky and porous. And so everything comes across, especially later in the disease. And that could be a major source of contamination, because the blood-brain barrier is such an incredible source of impediment to any kind of external agents, let alone plastics. But in Alzheimer's patients, we often see that even virus and bacteria that usually don't cross the blood-brain barrier, you find it in the tissue of those that have suffered late onset or later disease of Alzheimer's. So there's a lot of confound here, a lot of things that could be giving you false outcomes. And yet with a small sample that we're talking about, 6 Alzheimer's, 3 vascular, and with all these other factors, we immediately jump to microplastics, which makes it very problematic.
Yeah. Ali, the authors also said that they did some cross-validations just to defend their own theory. And there are some acronyms like FTIR or EDS, basically to confirm that other polymers were not as consistent in prevalence. What does that inconsistency mean methodologically? Is this something that is usually done, like cross-validation?
Yes, so it's a really good thing to do with microplastic work, is to check your results with different analytical techniques, and hopefully you would get the same answer. So FGIR is Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. So that's essentially shining a light on the particles, and then you see which wavelengths of light are absorbed or transmitted through the particle, and then that gives you a sort of a fingerprint, depending on which wavelengths were blocked and which weren't, which you can then match to some known samples. So it's another way of looking at microplastics. Instead of using mass spec, you use spectroscopy, but it's much less sensitive. You need a bigger sample size or a bigger bit of plastic to look at. It's very easy to get a spectra that looks a bit like a plastic, but it's not quite plastic. Or if you've got a plastic particle that's degraded, it doesn't give you the same thing. And it's much harder to do at scale. So if you imagine you're trying to look through a sample, you've got to find each particle under the microscope, shine the light on it, get the measurement back. It takes a lot more time. And it's very easy to, something could be obscured. If there's two particles, one behind the other, you might only think there's one. You need a bit of specialist training to be able to do that properly. If we believe everything in this paper was absolutely true, let's just say everything was correct. I think they only had a total of about 52 brains from New Mexico, essentially. Right? And then they're saying we all have a spoon's worth of plastic in our brain. You can't really say, based on stuff in New Mexico, that someone in California or someone in Australia or someone anywhere else in the world will have exactly the same pattern. It's a very small sample size. It's really interesting, actually. It's caused a real discussion in the analytical chemistry community about how should we be measuring microplastics. But the field itself of microplastic measurements, I think, has problems because lots of people are trying to do it. Lots of people are doing it different ways, and they don't have a consistent analytical approach. And that makes it very difficult to compare results from different studies. So it's a bit different to say medicine. If you've got someone that comes to you with blood test results, you know that those blood test results have been done in a validated way, and it's done the same way in every different lab that people go to, or should be done relatively similarly, so you can interpret them. But when people come with microplastic data, often they're doing it vastly different approaches, and sometimes they just don't have the experience to know how tricky analytical chemistry is, and they've just run the sample, done the best they can, but there's just stuff that they're not aware of, and it's potentially impacting the results.
Makes complete sense. Ollie, there was a study by Marfella, that was the last name of the author, in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they found microplastics in arterial plaques. It was news a few months ago, and they linked them to cardiovascular events. They also used the same pyrolysis methodology. They added other methods on top of that as well. How do you assess that evidence?
Well, we can't say they definitely caused the heart disease because we didn't assess all the other things that might have caused heart disease that the patient might have been exposed to. Maybe they had a family history. Maybe they had a poor diet. Maybe they smoked. So all they said was there's an association here in that potentially the people that had worse heart disease had more microplastics in their plaque. But also that study didn't have any blank samples from their operating theatre. So how do you know that stuff wasn't introduced? You know, the people that had the worst disease may have just had more operations or a more serious operation, but because they didn't measure background contamination in their operating theatre, it's possible that all of the stuff they measured was actually introduced during the operation, because some of the plastics in that study were the same type of plastic that you would find in a plastic catheter that you would use to introduce an anesthetic, or that you might use to unblock an artery and things like that. I mean, to be fair to them, they didn't say that the microplastics were causing heart disease. They went to some effort to point out that not what they were claiming. They were just saying there's an association. But correlation is not causation, as any stats professor will tell you. And it just gives you an idea of what might be worth looking at future. And that's assuming that all the measurements were correct, which I think using the pyrolysis does introduce a bit of a problem. And then, as I say, they didn't have blanks, and they didn't look at, well, does this make sense from these plastics look like the ones we have in our operating theatre? So maybe they came from there, and they didn't rule that out.
Interesting. That is very interesting. So right now, if someone is watching or listening to this conversation and they've seen all the headlines partially propagated by us and, about plastic in the brain, what should they actually be concerned about, and what is being overclaimed?
Well, I think the issue of plastic pollution is an interesting one. I'm not saying that plastic isn't a problem in the environment. There's a few ways you might be exposed to microplastics, or they might get into your body. Dermal absorption has been posited. So if you have some skin creams used to have microbeads in them that were little plastic particles, exfoliate the skin, but they're mostly banned now. But actually, the skin's actually a pretty good barrier. It's quite hard to get something to go through the skin and into the bloodstream. I don't think dermal absorption, probably not need to worry about. Then there is eating microplastics in our food and swallowing them in that way. But the problem there is we know that your body can't really absorb stuff from the digestive tract if it's above a certain size. So I think it's about 10 microns inside. If you can see it, you're definitely not going to absorb it. It's just going to go straight through you. It has to be really, really small to get through the gut lining, which is relatively thick and well controlled. So most likely anything you eat is probably just going to go out the other end without causing too much problem. The other method is inhalation, so breathing them in. So if you have very, very small particles potentially in the air, you breathe them in, the lining of the lung, it's very thin to facilitate gas exchange, but you've got basically sort of liquid covering. You have to be like 1 micron or smaller to pass the lining of the lung and get into the bloodstream that way. But because we know that small particles in the air in general are bad, that's why we measure things like, if you look at your air quality monitoring, it will say something like PM10 levels and PM2.5 levels. And that stands for particulate matter 10 microns in diameter and particulate matter 2.5 microns in diameter and smaller. Now, as a whole, PM10s and PM2.5s are bad for us. There are some microplastic particles that are that small. PM10s as a whole, it's mostly like particles from burning fossil fuel or cars and things like that. So the microplastics are a teeny tiny component and we already measure it. So as long as your PM2.5 levels are sort of in the safe limits, which you can easily check usually with your local EPA or whatever, it's generally not something to panic about.
The more important part of this, I think, is it's not the study of the moment. It's not the hype of the moment. It's our relationship with data and how we look at data and how we scrutinize the data and how we extrapolate beyond the data or within the confines of the data is the most important conversation we can have in our society today. Because with the rise of social media and everything else, we're going to be overwhelmed with information. And what we have to do is, even in a very difficult, uncomfortable, sometimes half known, half unknown, which is what we're doing here, be comfortable with how we look at the data and look at the science and try to hold ourselves accountable, not to extrapolate.
And I want to clarify, when you say we, it essentially means we, the science communicators, because the general public, they rely on good science communication. And sometimes when news like this gets sensationalized, so the paper came out and then suddenly you saw it on CNN, BBC, headline news all over the world. It's very difficult for the layperson who's not necessarily well versed in scientific literature to be able to filter through these things.
I think what we need to come out of this conversation is what piece of information can the general public, even more important than the microplastics argument, because today's microplastics, tomorrow it's something else, is the fact that the methodology of how they've drawn the conclusion is actually something that we can all hold society accountable. You don't need to know organic chemistry or spectroscopy, things of that nature. We can all, as a society, not just scientists, say, how did you come up with this conclusion? And show me how you distinguished between plastic and fat. Was it a light that you shown? It doesn't make sense to me. A spoonful of microplastics? How did you come up with that?
Yeah. And do other scientists in the field agree with you? Is
Correct.
there a consensus about the methodology that you were using? Like, this paper came out, nobody saw the criticism. I didn't see the criticism.
Correct.
Like,
You were holding the plastic spoon, I remember.
didn't do the due diligence to look at the criticism about this work, right? Because it was published in a corner of the journal and it wasn't a major news because the main headline just took over.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right.
And the work you're doing here, like, this is difficult work, showing that you burn the plastic or the hydrocarbon and what's left behind is indistinguishable. And this difference in size has to do with the fact that in Alzheimer's versus vascular, the blood-brain barrier, there's multiple layers of explaining. But you know what? What we're doing, hopefully, and what you're doing often, is raising that awareness in society about how to scrutinize, how to be incredulous, and how to question things. And when you're coming to a final conclusion, which is often rare to come to the final absolute conclusion, it better be pushed by dozens of papers from different kind of science, from different kind of scientists, with a consensus reports all pointing in the same direction. Then we say, okay, I'm slightly comfortable with this. If we get society to accept that level of discomfort, we've really lifted the floor of how we communicate reality.
I fully agree with you. I think I always tell my students, you've got to think critically.
Yes.
Like, just believe I don't know, but I would find sometimes my students will just say, oh, look, I read this and I think this is the case. And you're like, why do you think that? Walk me through it. And often they just haven't thought about it, right? And I don't think people, even if you've got no scientific training at all, you could think, a plastic spoon in my brain, that's a lot. Like, where did that come from? Because, again, as I tell my students, a good theory can accept criticism and stand up to it. So if you're right, you should be able to defend your work. As a field, microplastic research hasn't quite done that yet. And some people might be thinking, well, he's just one person. Why should I listen to what he says? But I'm not the only. If you look at the World Health Organization, the US Food and Drug Administration, and the European Food Safety Authority have all done big reviews of all the literature on microplastics and potential harms, and independently all say that there is no strong evidence that they're causing harm. And several of them, the EFSA in particular, was very critical of some of the standards of the papers that were published, saying your methods weren't good enough to be able to say what you're saying. It's much less of an issue than, say, not exercising or not sleeping properly or having a poor diet. You're much more likely to cause harm to yourself by drinking a lot of alcohol or having a lot of fast food, not having your vegetables, than you are to have a problem from microplastics.
Yeah.
I agree. And then the disproportionality, like you said, if something seems really disproportional, question it. Like, I always question Australia, a population of 30 million, having this many gold medals in swimming. That just doesn't make sense. You got to question. It can't be just swimming away from the sharks. I just can't believe it. So you have to question everything.
Oh, God.
Yeah. This is such a great lesson. It's such a great conversation. Most people feel frustrated with the noise and the ether of communication and the noise and the method of communicating science. I don't. I think that every time you do this push back and forth and arguing and discussing and making this difficult conversation, you're really making a difference in the background of people's awareness of how to look at data, look at science. So we can't thank you enough.
Yes.
First of all,
Here's to better science, more conversations,
Yes.
and being comfortable with nuance.
Yeah, I'll drink to that.
So here's where we land. A while back, we told you that you eat a spoonful of plastic every day and it sits in your brain. It won us a Webby. It also, as it turns out, wasn't quite right. The data simply didn't stretch as far as the headlines did. And I'll be honest, nothing humbles a neurologist faster than being out-reasoned about his own organ. But I want to be clear about why we're doing this episode and why we're ending it this way, instead of just quietly editing the video and hoping nobody notices it. Because in science, in medicine, in life, being wrong was never the failure. Refusing to update is the failure. This spoonful made a great headline. The truth will make a better lesson. We're living in a moment that's engineered to reward certainty and punish nuance. The loudest claim wins the click, but the careful ones get buried. But your brain, the actual 3 pounds of you that makes every decision you'll ever make, doesn't run on headlines. It runs on the quality of what you let in. So here's the ask. Hold your beliefs the way good scientists do. Firmly enough to act on, but loosely enough to let better evidence change them. Be suspicious of anything that's too clean, too scary, or too perfectly built to be shared. And give yourself permission to say the 3 words behind every real advance in human knowledge. I was wrong. That's not a weakness. That's exactly how a brain and a species gets better with age.